My guest tonight is a giant of a man, both figuratively and literally speaking. He towers over 6 feet in height. He weighs about 250 pounds. He has great big strong hands. But it is not for his physical stature that he's known the world over. It's for his music. He's been called simply the best jazz pianist in the world. And he's Canadian, although many Canadians think that he's American, and many Americans think that he lives in the States or that he lives in England. His 3 Grammys and his 16 Downbeat Awards grace his home in Mississauga, Ontario. He's Oscar Peterson, and we taped the following interview with him when he was in Calgary doing some work for the Royal Bank. I was listening to an interview with Earl Father Hines just recently, and he was talking about learning piano techniques as a kid, and it sounded as if he was just a little kid, maybe 11 or 12. And he said that he learned the right hand from one fella and the left hand from another famous piano player of the day. I mean, is it that technical that you can learn the technique for one hand from one person and the other hand from another?
Well, it is. It depends on what you want out of it, Marie. In other words, obviously Earl heard something played by someone whose right hand technique impressed him, and perhaps from an accompanying standpoint, and I think he's probably talking about solo piano, which is a difficult animal. It's one thing to play with a group. It's very difficult to go out there, and I'm not saying this because I'm doing it, but I know it because I do it. To go out there and play for yourself, by yourself, for 2 hours.
Yeah. But to be able to meld what obviously must have been 2 very different techniques into one.
Well, they're different anyway, because what you do with the left hand to back up the right hand is totally different. The right hand is playing the creative, usually the creative, inventive lines. The left hand is supplying the cushion. Although I've always contended that actually what you play in the right hand is dictated by what harmonies you play with your left hand. You're playing, I always tell my students that you play off of your left hand.
Do you still have students, or do you have the time anymore?
No, not really. I do
You had
seminars.
a school, didn't you?
I had a school at one time in Toronto, and that took up too much time. I wish I did have the time to teach. But I go to various universities throughout the world, for that matter, and hold seminars.
Well, you sort of think that when one is the best in the world in a particular field, that it would be very difficult to teach someone else.
That's true. It's very difficult to teach jazz, period.
Yeah.
You can't really teach jazz. You can only direct a person with some of the requirements, some of the pitfalls that you try and steer them around, and give them some creative incentive that you can give them, and make some things perhaps a little easier for a beginner or beginners.
We were talking earlier about a series that you had seen on the BBC, I think, in England, which was called Masterclass. Tell us about that, because that sounds like a fascinating concept.
I arrived in London one night, well, this is a few years ago. I inevitably ended up doing one of these things, but I arrived in London one night, turned on the television, and there was a lady, I didn't recognize her at the time, sitting in a wheelchair, believe it or not, and she had 3 students playing cellos. And she was criticizing them as they played, I mean, constructively, of course. She was saying, no, that passage didn't sing. I would like it to sing, and the reason it's not singing, and she was breaking down some of the mistakes that they were making procedurally in trying to play this particular selection. And it was incredible, because at the end of the master class, when they played the same thing over, you could hear a vast difference in their approach. It made all the difference in the world.
Would you like to see something like that masterclass idea on Canadian television?
I think we should have something like that. At one point, I was thinking of trying to do something like that on radio, and I still think it should be done. I think on weekends it would aid a lot of youngsters that are struggling with instruments, especially in the jazz field. If they were to have people such as Ray Brown or Dizzy Gillespie or Roy Eldridge or Joe Pass spend a half an hour on the air saying, I do it this way. When this happens, for instance, Joe Pass is a great teacher because Joe is very normal. He's very natural. And he goes right to
You mean as opposed to other jazz musicians?
Yeah, you have to be natural. And yet you have to be careful not to make the mistake of being too offhanded about it, because there is a certain necessary regimentation in playing. You have to have a certain amount of control. And Joe's the type of person that would say, you know, I play bad notes all the time. He'll start off by saying this. You know, it takes a big man to admit that he's wrong. But then he has a wonderful way of saying, but I get around it by doing this. And at the end of it, you suddenly realize that this man's musical abilities are so vast that there is no such thing as a mistake to him. It's just something that leads you in another direction, creatively.
It's just his way.
That's his way.
How influenced were you by Art Tatum? Because one reads that you were greatly influenced.
Well, if you mean by influence, frightened, yes. My first thing, I was scared to death of Art Tatum. That's an awesome experience for a young player. I think it still is. I can remember different players talking about the first time they met Art. I vividly remember the first night I met him. He came down to hear me in Washington, and I was in the middle, ironically enough. It was my earlier, I think my second nightclub appearance in the United States. And my bass player at the time, Ray Brown, I used to kid about, you know, I used to kid him about another bass player that was well-known, Oscar Pettiford. And whenever he made something very difficult, I'd say, you better watch that. Oscar Pettiford just walked in. He'd say, oh, the heck with him, you know. Or I'd make a very difficult passage. He'd say, oh, what's that? Art Tatum standing out there. So, oh, you know. And one night he said it, but the tone in his voice was a little different. And I looked out of the bar, and it was Art. And I was frightened to death. You know, there's no other way of putting it. I was scared to death.
How well did you play?
Terribly. I almost stopped, and I'm not exaggerating. He had that kind of effect on me. However, in getting to know the man as a human being, I got to know him even better as a player, and we were very close friends.
Don't you find that the really great ones in most fields are the most secure and therefore the nicest to know?
No.
No, you don't find that?
You explain Buddy Rich to me.
Well, okay. I can't. How do you explain that in this country we have so many fine pianists in this country? I mean, is it something in the water? We have LaPlante and Gagnon and Gould and Peterson. How do you explain it?
Well, I think we should have more, actually. I don't think that Canadian composers are and I'm not saying this just to be critical, I think that it should be played up in this country more often, that it was written by Canadian. I'll give you a good example. When I went to the United States years ago, I was taught a tune called, I can't even think of it, it's on my album, I'll think of the title in a moment. Anyway, on Jazz at the Philharmonic with Ella and Dizzy and Ryan, they decided to play this tune, Sweethearts on Parade. Great. I looked up and I said, I don't know it. So Roy Eldridge taught me the tune. Just before I did this album called The Personal Touch, in which I did the thing for the Royal Bank, they talked to me about tunes, and they said, why don't you do a whole bunch of Canadian tunes? I said, fine. I look up on the list, they have Sweethearts on Parade. I said, what's that tune? That's not a Canadian tune. He said, it is. It was written by a Canadian. I didn't know that. I didn't know the world is waiting for a sunrise. For the sunrise was written by a Canadian. Did you?
No.
That's what I meant.
No.
I had somebody ask me the other day, they said to me, you're an Order of Canada. I said, yeah. They said, well, you know, why do they give it to certain people? I said, and they, again, most Canadians don't know what that particular medal is all about.
What does it mean to you?
I think it's given to Canadians as an incentive to encourage other Canadians. I think that's all it's really about. It isn't a matter that you're the greatest in your field. It isn't an evaluation of what you've done, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10. It's just a thing saying thank you for giving Canadians the incentive to want to do as well as you've done. That's all that is, I think.
Yeah, but it's an achievement award as well. I think you're being too modest.
No, I think that's what it all is. It's all about.
Is that your proudest achievement? Because you have had so many awards from so many countries and so many organizations throughout a lifetime. Is it the topper? Is it the one that means the most, or
I have to be honest.
are there others?
The most important award to me was when I was voted musician's musician.
Yeah, it doesn't get any better than that, does it?
Well, for a musician, I don't think you can.
Yeah. You started piano lessons at what, 5? When you were 5 years old? Was that because you wanted to, or
No.
because you had parents who said, little
parents
Oscar
said,
is going
yeah.
to take music lessons?
They said, yeah, you're going to learn to play something.
Yeah.
On some instrument.
You also studied piano, or trumpet rather,
Right.
didn't you? And then gave that one up.
Due to illness, yes.
Ah. Thank goodness for the world that you did.
Well, I don't know. I used to tell Dizzy Gillespie that he's lucky. I might have been looking for, I don't know, not really. But
I was reading something the other day, and I don't know whether it was a quote from you, but some interviewer had turned up at a studio to do an interview with you. I mean, I'm obviously well prepared to do this interview, and said, where do you stand when you play the trumpet?
Yeah.
What did you say to him?
I told him on the piano.
Oh, how did you feel about that? I mean, that's so insulting.
I look at that as an unskilled craftsman because I look at it in relationship to what I do. I think that what I do is a craft, it's a profession, and I know I have to prepare myself to do it. So it's like me trying to just play a tune that I really don't know in public. So I figure there's a reporter or interviewer that hasn't done their homework, so it's a pretty bad interview.
A lot of people don't realize that you live in Canada. That has surprised me.
A lot of people don't realize I'm Canadian.
Somewhere else in the world.
Usually the United States, Mary.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because of the music, that's a little more understandable because blacks are usually certainly related to jazz by listeners, and so it's more natural that they would think that. I've been caught in many situations like that. I did an interview, I was telling a friend of mine the other day, for about 2 hours sitting on the Via Condotti in Rome several years ago, being interviewed by the New York Herald Tribune, and in the middle of it, he said to me, now, where do you live in the United States? You know, he didn't know. I've done State Department concerts where they've had parties for me afterwards and sat there, as I said, with my Canadian passport pulsing in my pocket while they're extolling my virtues
as this great American citizen.
Yeah.
You didn't ever go through a lot of those horrendous nightmares that a lot of the early black musicians and singers, people like Lena Horne, went through in the States. Do you relate to...
Oh, you mean racially?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I went through some of those.
You did go through that?
Certainly not what they did, because they grew up in that atmosphere. I went through some of it in the early days with Jazz at the Philharmonic, because we used to tour the South.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people like Lena Horne actually left the country, didn't they? A long time
Yes,
ago.
she did.
Because of that attitude. Well,
I think it's unfortunate. It's the phase that it seems that people felt they had to go through. It's very strange about that, not to dwell on that, but I've discovered one thing that I really don't like about that. You talk about oppression in the world without naming any racism. We're just talking about the act of oppression. And I have discovered that, believe it or not, it is usually, if there's an attempt is going to be made to oppress you, whether verbally, physically, nationalistically, environmentally, it's usually by someone that has just come out from under the heel of another form of oppression.
But in Canada, we sort of pride ourselves on the fact that there is really no racial discrimination and no prejudice, and we are these wonderfully democratic people. Have you found that to be so in this country?
I have to credit the Royal Bank with having a lot of courage, not because I did the commercial for them, but doing a commercial with any black. Because I have a thing at home right now where, you see, Toronto is fed by the Canadian networks, but also by Buffalo, right? And you can turn on, I won't call any product names, but you can turn on a soft drink commercial, let's say, and you can see Tony Dorsett, Tracy Austin, and John McEnroe, right? But you never, on the Canadian equivalent of that, with all the black football players and the black baseball players that are trying to win the pennant for Montreal and every other city, you never see one on those. I don't believe that some of the agencies believe that ethnics brush their teeth or use hair dye. I don't happen to use it, but
Come on, we know you do, Oscar.
No, I dyed gray.
What, I mean, you're this huge celebrity, you're the best there is in the world. What are you doing running around doing jingles for a bank?
Well, it's a challenge because I think it was a very interesting program. First of all, occasionally when I managed to put together a couple of dollars, I occasionally open a bank account, or would like to open a bank account. And I think the convenience offered by this new method is interesting because this is now the age of convenience. You know, I have a computer at home. I have a musical computer, and I have a computer for the information. And it was a challenge to me because it was something different, and it was a matter of trying to show people that there is an easier way of doing it at your own leisure, and doing it in actually a very personal way because you're not dealing with anyone. You're dealing directly with yourself. You know, you're putting in your information into your account and getting back whatever information, yes or no, monetarily.
You like playing the buttons, that's what it is.
I like playing with buttons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Speaking of playing with buttons, how do you feel about the electronic music of today? Is it musical? To me, it sounds very unmusical.
Because much of it is unskilled right now. But if you were to realize that so much of it that you heard, you weren't even see, the good electronic music, you're not even aware of it as being electronic. That's the first requirement.
Well, maybe I'm just talking about this really metallic, that heavy metal sound that they talk about.
Yeah, well, that's the heavy metal sound is made by people that don't know how to put together good sounds. I spent the last 2 years studying synthesis with a variety of teachers, and it's a very interesting art form. You know, because it gives a person like myself, for instance, the ability to create a solo on the piano, and if I want a certain type of background, I can put it in with that kind of sound, with all of the musical nuances that I want behind it.
It's kind of egotistical in a way, is it? I mean, you can be a one-man band.
No, but have you ever found a composer that really was satisfied with the way his or her compositions were played?
No.
Yeah, because you come to it with a personal approach.
Yeah. I heard an interview with Yehudi Menuhin not too long ago, and he said that, I mean, this is only his personal contention, that the music of an era is sort of a reflection of that society at that given time. And when he was asked about the current music, you know, the heavy metal sound, the rock and so on, he said, well, it reflects this society. It's a brutal, strident, kind of monotonous society. Do you agree with that? Do you? Yeah. That's kind of a sad commentary then, isn't it, on this age we're living in?
Well, by the same token, some of the great Negro spirituals reflected oppression, didn't they? And some of the European music reflected a certain amount of oppression during the years of the various czars and so forth. So a music is not necessarily written with a cry in mind, but it's an outpouring of the composer's soul. I'm working on a suite for Africa, and I have to include South Africa. And the music is pretty, I think the particular theme called Darkness to Light is fairly ominous. But then South Africa, to my view, is a fairly ominous place.
Do you see the light there?
They're going to someday.
Yeah. I also heard an interview with Isaac Stern the other night, and he talked about the feeling. I think the question that was asked him was, you know, how do you bring a freshness every time you're playing a Brahms concerto or whatever? Where do you find that sort of resource or that wellspring? And he said, well, it's a source or a sense of renewal and discovery every time you play that piece of music. And what really it amounts to, what the bottom line is this communication, this human communication that can only be done on this particular level. Do you get that feeling?
Yes, I say that, that when people try to ascertain the difference between classical and popular music, or classical and jazz, let's say, they often say, well, is it harder to be a jazz player or a classical player? I maintain it's harder to be a jazz player. And there'll be a hue and cry from certain factions, but classical players will tell you that. Because you will more readily have a jazz player that could revert to playing classics than you could have a classical player that could sit in with my group or some of the other group and make sense. Mm-hmm. But in playing classical music, there is a renewal that you're looking for of interpretation. In playing jazz, you are doing what I call instant composition. You're being hit with a set of harmonic changes, and you're reacting to them right away, creatively, compositionally. You're creating lines. You're even changing some of those harmonic progressions. You don't do that in classical music, not in the particular time we're talking about.
Composing is very important to you, isn't it?
It is now. I didn't have the patience for it years ago, but I do now.
You've said that your music has matured.
I hope it has.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's like you learn what is really relevant. It's like reading news. You know, you can, even in newspapers and writers, you know their styles after a while. You learn what is really relevant insofar as what you want to say. And you learn over the years a skill of saying it with the most possible truth.
So you're kind of refining it in a way.
A continual
all the
process
time.
of refinement.
Yeah. You've done movies too, haven't you? You've scored movies. Is that an interesting challenge?
So far, I'm not that crazy about it because, you know, the time limitation, really, you start out with where you're going to have 6 weeks to write it, and you look up and it's like 6 hours. And I don't like doing things like that. You know, I'd like to, as I told a friend of mine, Joel Michaels, who produced the recent Jack Lemmon film, I said, you know, just as you bring on the stars the first day on the lot, you should have the composer there from day one. And if he or she wants to write something and have them play it while the actors are acting, it should be that way because it should all actually have an effect. Ironically enough, John Williams, if you read the liner notes on the back of his album, I think for Close Encounters, says exactly the same thing.
We keep hearing about every 10 years that jazz is coming back. I mean, has jazz ever been away?
No.
It's always been around.
It always has been around. I think it has been probably the most successful and most successfully used music of any. Because when you think of all the jazz writers, like Lala Schifrin, Quincy Jones, Pat Williams, Jerry Fielding, these people like this that wrote jazz, on television alone, day to day, day in, day, all the sitcoms, all the detective stories. I even wrote a detective story series, never showed, but I did the pilot and several of them. And so consequently, it's just been sort of sitting there, and every once in a while someone says, jazz is back, and it hasn't gone anywhere.
In closing, I should thank the Royal Bank here in Calgary for letting us demolish one of their executive offices for the interview that we did with Oscar Peterson. That's the program for tonight. We'll see you again next week at the same time.